Okay, let's take all the information that we know about the trig functions, all the information that we know about degrees, all the information that we know about radians, and we're going to put those things together to look at the trig functions going around the unit circle, except instead of focusing on degrees like we did before, we're going to focus on radians. You're going to want to have your unit circle paper in front of you. Probably you're going to want to have your notes from lessons 11 and 13 as well, so you can focus on those. And we're going to be looking specifically again at these two triangles, just like we did when we looked at degrees. Okay, we need these two ratios. We talked already about why these ratios are what they are, but if you will go ahead and write those again at the top of your paper, that's going to help you to memorize them, and these will have to be memorized. In fact, everything on the unit circle is going to have to be memorized over the course of the next couple weeks. Okay, let's look at this one. So sine of 7 pi over 6. Let's put together the things that we have already learned from several of our past videos. Okay, when I have a 6 in the denominator, 6 goes into 180 30 times, so that tells me that my reference angle is going to be 30. So when I get ready to answer this question, I'm going to be focusing on this triangle because it has that 30-degree angle in the corner. All right, the quadrant that I'm in. You guys remember, to find the quadrant, you're going to look at the numerator and how it relates to the denominator. Well, in this case, the numerator is 1 more than the denominator, which means we went 1 whole pi, which is 180 degrees, and then we went a little bit more. So think about the unit circle, picture it in your head. If you go 180 degrees and then a little bit more, pi is 180 degrees, you went 1 whole pi and then a little bit more, that means you are now in the third quadrant. Okay, and we have our little phrase that we use when we go around the circle. All students take calculus. You can also remember that as cast. If you want to start there in the fourth quadrant, cast is what you see. But in the third quadrant right here, I've got T. T stands for tangent. That means tangent is positive, cotangent is positive because it's the reciprocal, and everything else is negative. So the sign that I get for my answer is going to be negative. Okay, go back and look at that 30-degree triangle. Think about the ratio for sine. Sine is opposite over hypotenuse. The opposite side of 30 degrees is 1. The hypotenuse of 30 degrees is 2. And then I want to make my final answer negative because I'm in the third quadrant. So the sine of 7 pi over 6 is negative 1/2. When we take the quiz, the test, you're going to need to be able to do this without your calculator. Okay, let's do another one. How about the cosine of negative 5 pi over 3? Okay, so again, that 3 tells me my reference angle. 3 goes into 180 60 times. So my reference angle is 60. Okay, now let's look at the relationship between the numerator and the denominator. My numerator is equal to my denominator times 2 minus 1. That tells me I went 4 quadrants, but I went 4 quadrants in the negative direction. So if I go in the negative direction 4 quadrants, do you see that end up back in the first quadrant? So this is actually a first quadrant answer. In the first quadrant, what's positive? Well, remember that was our A from all students take calculus, and A means all of them. So my answer is going to be positive. Okay, so go back and look at that same triangle, the one with the 60-degree angle in the other corner. Cosine. Cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse. The adjacent side to 60, the one that's next to but not the hypotenuse, is 1. The hypotenuse is 2. And because I'm in the first quadrant, my answer is going to be positive. So positive 1/2 is going to be the answer to this question. Oops. All right, tangent of pi over 4. Okay, when I've got that 4 in the denominator, 4 goes into 180 45 times. So my reference angle is 45 degrees. The quadrant. Okay, look at my numerator. My numerator is 1 pi. Remember, my numerator is 1. That means I went into the first quadrant in a positive direction. So my quadrant here is 1. And we already said that in the first quadrant, everything is positive. Okay, so this time I'm looking at that 45, 45, 90 triangle. So I want you to take your eyes on your paper and look at this one. Instead of the 30, 60, 90 triangle, we're going to focus on this one this time. Tangent is opposite over adjacent. And in a 45, 45, 90 triangle, both the opposite and the adjacent are the same because it's isosceles. 1 divided by 1 is 1, and my sign is positive. So the answer to tangent pi over 4 is positive 1. All right, how about cosecant of negative pi? Okay, so the denominator here is 1. I went 1 whole pi, which puts me at 180 degrees, which is on the line. So I don't really have a reference angle or a quadrant or a sign. In this case, I'm going to look at that particular point and remember the coordinates of that point. The x value is negative 1 because I went 1 unit to the left because in the unit circle, my radius is 1. And I went no units up or down. So negative 1, 0 are the coordinates of that point. Okay, now you also have to remember, we've talked about in other videos, that cosine goes with x and sine goes with y. Well, cosecant is the reciprocal of sine, right? Cosecant of theta equals 1 over sine of theta. All right, sine of theta in this case is 0. So cosecant of theta equals 1 over 0. So when I divide anything other than 0 by 0, I'm going to get undefined. So the answer to this question is undefined. The cosecant of negative pi is undefined. Negative pi just means I went this way, pi radians, and cosecant, the reciprocal of sine, the reciprocal of 0, puts 0 down in that denominator, which means this one is undefined. Okay, how about this one? Secant of 5 pi over 6. Okay, so think for just a second. 6 in the denominator. What reference angle does that give me? It gives me a reference angle of 30. 6 goes into 180 30 times. Okay, and let's figure out what quadrant we're in. So look at the relationship between the numerator and the denominator. The numerator is equal to the denominator minus 1. That means we didn't quite make it all the way to pi radians, so we're in the second quadrant because pi radians would be 180 degrees. It would be halfway around the circle, and we didn't quite make it there, so we're in the second quadrant. Okay, so all students take calculus. Here I am in the second quadrant. So that means that in the second quadrant, sine and cosecant are positive, which means everything else, including secant, are negative. So we have a negative on our final answer. Okay, so now let's look at that 30, 60, 90 triangle. We know that cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse, and secant is the reciprocal of cosine, so it's going to be hypotenuse over adjacent. Okay, so for 30 degrees, what is the hypotenuse? It's 2. It doesn't matter which angle you're looking at. The hypotenuse of this triangle is always 2. Okay, so now let's look at the adjacent. Adjacent means next to, but not the hypotenuse. So the side that is next to my 30-degree angle is the square root of 3. Okay, so this is a problem. I have a square root in the denominator. It's like bad math grammar. So we want to rationalize this fraction, and we've practiced this already. To rationalize this, I'm going to multiply by square root of 3 on the top and the bottom. So I'm going to get 2 square root of 3 over 3. Remember, in the denominator, square root of 3 times square root of 3 is 3. And the sign, I need to go back, and this is going to be a negative because cosine and secant in the second quadrant are negative. So my final answer, negative 2 square root of 3 over 3. All right, how about cotangent? We haven't done one of these yet. So 6 in the denominator. That's going to give me a reference angle of 30. All right, and my numerator is negative pi. Okay, when my numerator is just plain pi, that means I went 1 quadrant away from 0, but I went 1 quadrant in the negative direction, which puts me down here in the 4th quadrant. Okay, so all students take calculus. I've got C in the 4th quadrant. That means cosine is positive, and the reciprocal of cosine, which is secant, is also positive. Everything else is negative. That tells me that cotangent is going to be negative down there in my fourth quadrant. Okay, cotangent. Let's see if we can remember the ratio for cotangent. Tangent is opposite over adjacent, so that means cotangent is going to be adjacent over opposite. Okay, so go back to that 30-degree triangle. Look at the adjacent side to 30. What's next to 30 but not the hypotenuse? That's going to be square root of 3. And the opposite of 30 across from 30 is 1. Square root of 3 over 1, that simplifies to just be plain old square root of 3. And now I need to go back and make that negative because in the fourth quadrant, cotangent and tangent are both negative. So negative square root of 3 is going to be my answer there. All right, let's do cotangent again. And we're going to focus this time on the quadrantal angles because they can be a little bit tricky. All right, I don't have my reference angle and all that listed over here because I'm looking at one of my quadrantal angles. Negative pi over 2, that's right here. All right, that's 90 degrees just in a negative direction. So the value that we had for our point, my x coordinate was 0 because I went right and left none. My y coordinate was -1. And remember we said that cosine goes with x and sine goes with y. Okay, now look at the top of your paper. What ratio did you write on the top of your paper for cotangent? All right, cotangent is cosine over sine. So we just basically take the values of that point that we know to be true off the unit circle and substitute them in. Cosine is 0, sine is -1, and 0 divided by anything other than 0 is 0. So the cotangent of negative pi over 2 is 0. All right, let's do one more cotangent. This time we're going to do cotangent of negative pi. And again, that's one of my quadrantal angles. That's right here, which means I went this way, pi radians in a negative direction. And we already said one time before, the coordinates of this point, x is -1 because I went left 1, and y is 0 because I went up and down none. And we already said that cotangent is equal to cosine of theta over sine of theta. And we already said that cosine goes with x and sine goes with y. So cosine, which is my x value, over sine, which is my y value, and 1 divided by 0, well, that's undefined. As long as I have 0 in the denominator, it's going to end up being undefined. So the cotangent of negative pi is undefined.